Political pressure from the White House was conveyed to me in January 1973 by John Caulfield to remain silent, take executive clemency by going off to prison quietly, and I was told that while there I would receive financial aid and later rehabilitation and a job. My participation in the Watergate operation, on my part, for whatever reasons I may have had at the time, whatever rationale I may have had at the time, was an error, was a mistake, and a very grave mistake, which I regret.
The fact that I was involved in obstruction of justice, the fact that I assisted another in perjured testimony, the fact that I made personal use of funds that were in my custody. It's far easier to talk about these things myself than to talk about what others did. The President told me I had done a good job, and he appreciated how difficult a task it had been, and the President was pleased that the case had stopped with Liddy. I responded that I could not take credit because others had done much more difficult things than I had done. As the President discussed the present status of the situation, I told him that all I'd been able to do was to contain the case and assist in keeping it out of the White House. I also told him that there was a long way to go before this matter would end, and that I certainly could make no assurances that the day would not come when this matter would not start to unravel. What I had hoped to do in this conversation was to have the President tell me we had to end the matter now. Accordingly, I gave considerable thought to how I would present this situation to the President and try to make as dramatic a presentation as I could to tell him how serious I thought the situation was that the cover-up continue. I began by telling the President that there was a cancer growing on the presidency, and that if the cancer was not removed, the President himself would be killed by it. I also told him that it was important that this cancer be removed immediately because it was growing more deadly every day.
The central question at this point is simply put, what did the President know, and when did he know it?
When do you think the President found out about Watergate and the cover-up?
I haven't any idea, Senator. I haven't any idea at all, because as I testified before, that if the President had found out about it, obviously he would have pursued his responsibilities in that area very vigorously.
Isn't it unfair that he's now undergoing the hostility and the suspicion of a nation in this respect, with the allegations of cover-up, with the lingering suspicion about what he knew? Well, isn't that far more unfair?
That's a statement that I'm not prepared to accept, Senator. I do not believe the nation feels that way, and I don't believe that anybody has come to the point where they have one shred of evidence that he was knowledgeable of the break-in of the cover-up.
I think you and I are talking about two different things.
Mr. Butterfield, are you aware of the installation of any listening devices in the Oval Office of the President?
I was aware of listening devices. Yes, sir.
When were those devices placed in the Oval Office?
Approximately the summer of 1970. I cannot begin to recall the precise date. My guess, Mr. Thompson, is that the installation was made between, and this is a very rough guess, April or May of 1970 and perhaps the end of the summer or early fall 1970.
Are you aware of any devices that were installed in the Executive Office Building office of the President?
Yes, sir, at that time.
The events that followed became known as the Saturday Night Massacre.
Good evening. The country tonight is in the midst of what may be the most serious constitutional crisis in its history. The President has fired the special Watergate prosecutor, Archibald Cox. Because of the President's action, the Attorney General has resigned. Elliot Richardson has quit, saying he cannot carry out Mr. Nixon's instructions. Richardson's deputy, William Ruckelshaus, has been fired. Ruckelshaus refused in a moment of constitutional drama to obey a presidential order to fire the special Watergate prosecutor. And half an hour after the special Watergate prosecutor had been fired, agents of the FBI, acting at the direction of the White House, sealed off the offices of the special prosecutor, the offices of the Attorney General, and the offices of the Deputy Attorney General.
6 FBI agents present, impeding our operations right now.
All of this adds up to a totally unprecedented situation, a grave and profound crisis in which the President has set himself against his own Attorney General and the Department of Justice. Nothing like this has ever happened before.
More than 50,000 telegrams poured in on Capitol Hill today. So many, Western Union was swamped. Most of them demanded impeaching Mr. Nixon.
These come from Republicans and businessmen and people, most of whom begin their statement by saying, I've supported the president, I've never believed in impeachment, but he's now gone too far, and we want the Congress to take strong action.
In my 3 district offices in the 1 Republican area, my phone calls were 100 to 1 in favor of pursuing the path of impeachment, which was rather shocking to me.
And I want to say this to the television audience. I made my mistakes, but in all of my years of public life, I have never profited from public service. I've earned every cent. And in all of my years of public life, I have never obstructed justice. And I think, too, that I can say that in my years of public life, that I welcome this kind of examination, because people have got to know whether or not their president's a crook. Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
President?
Yes.
Mr. Ford, you stated that the theory on which you pardoned Richard Nixon was that he had suffered enough. And I'm interested in that theory because the logical consequence of that is that somebody who resigns in the face of virtually certain impeachment, or somebody who is impeached, should not be punished, because the impeachment or the resignation in face of impeachment is punishment enough. And I wondered whether anybody had brought to your attention the fact that the Constitution specifically states that even though somebody is impeached, that person shall nonetheless be liable to punishment according to law.
Mrs. Holtzman, I was fully cognizant of the fact that the President, on resignation, was accountable for any criminal charges. But I would like to say that the reason I gave the pardon was not as to Mr. Nixon himself. I repeat, and I repeat with emphasis, the purpose of the pardon was to try and get the United States, the Congress, the President, and the American people focusing on the serious problems we have both at home and abroad. And I was absolutely convinced then, as I am now, that if we had had this series, an indictment, a trial, a conviction, and anything else that transpired after that, that the attention of the President, the Congress, and the American people would have been diverted from the problems that we have to solve. And that was the principal reason for my granting of the pardon.
Saigon, April the 30th, 8 o'clock. The last American helicopter on the roof of the American embassy prepares to lift off the last of the evacuees fleeing before the advancing communist armies. Back in the city, normal patterns of behavior broke down. In a climate of every man for himself, American homes, offices, and stores were looted of everything. The discarded equipment even ran to tanks, some damaged, but some also abandoned intact by their crews as they fled before the communists. And then, shortly after midday, came the climax of 30 years of fighting. the first North Vietnamese troops entered the city packed into trucks that flew the red and blue flag of the Communist Provisional Revolutionary Government, the PRG. Those who failed on that last day to get a place on the helicopters and who had reason to fear the communist takeover made for the only route that still offered a chance of escape, the Saigon River. Hundreds scrambled in panic onto any boats they could reach, not caring how they got aboard or what they left behind.
More than 80 helicopters shuttling people out to the carriers. Everyone was searched before being allowed to join the other evacuees. South Vietnamese Army pilots flew their families to safety aboard the carriers as well. But because there wasn't room to store their helicopters as well as those flown by American pilots, the Vietnamese were forced to ditch their aircraft at sea. The pilots were picked up by American Navy rescue boats.
My cameraman Neil Davis and I decided to stay. We saw the last helicopter leave from the roof. We then tried to scramble into the embassy ourselves. Neil got to the roof, I did not, and he saw dozens of Vietnamese just sitting on the helicopter pad on the roof of the embassy, waiting, wanting to get out, and of course no more helicopters were going to come.
I didn't join them. I actually scared. If the communists come in, the last thing we want them to see us is an American embassy. So we get out.
People were coming in and out of the buildings. Literally anything that could not be fastened down or was not fastened down was being taken away. Any souvenirs from the ambassador's office were taken away. Almost brick by brick, the embassy was being dismantled. It was ordinary looting, but more than that, I think it was just frustration and anger and an opportunity to get back perhaps at the Americans, because in the view of many in that crowd that day, we had deserted them.